So welcome everybody. We have a great afternoon planned. We had wanted to do this day the way we've done in past years, where we would have a variety of presentations from largely graduate students and postdocs, as well as a guest speaker. Beth has kindly agreed to be our speaker this way, although we had planned on doing it with her live. Just when it comes to questions, what we'll try and do, if people have questions as we're going through this, they can raise their hand, and then we will see it at the end of Beth's talk, or whoever is giving the presentation. When they're done, we can then see who's asked questions and in what order. We can then unmute that person. Like the instructions I sent out said, even though you're going to be unmuted from our end, you also need to unmute yourself, and then you can ask your question of Beth, hopefully orally, and we'll hope it works out. If not, we will figure something out.
We can always use the chat box, right?
Yeah, I just don't know how to keep up with that stuff.
Okay.
So the other option is that people can email me if they have any questions, and I could just ask those in order. Although I prefer if it was auditorily, because then it, if that's a word, because it also gives sort of more immediacy, I think, and more interaction.
Okay.
Okay, I don't, okay. All right, so without any further ado, welcome everyone to the 5th annual Dr. Ben Goldberg Developmental Disabilities Research Day. I see that Dr. Goldberg has joined us today, so welcome Ben and everybody else. We have a day with fantastic speakers all planned. So let us get started. So our first speaker is Dr. Elizabeth Kelley. She is an associate professor of psychology and a member of the Center for Neuroscience Studies at Queens. She completed her doctoral work at the University of Connecticut with Deborah Fine and has more than 40 published papers and received numerous grants and awards. The importance of her work in autism has also been recognized by Autism Speaks in the United States several times by inclusion in their top 10 findings of the year, and also by the Department of Health and Human Services in the United States as well. Elizabeth's research interests focus primarily on how the early appearing core social deficits in autism lead into later difficulties with many aspects of development. She is also involved in a large-scale longitudinal study investigating optimal outcomes in individuals with autism, specifically individuals who are diagnosed with autism in early childhood, but no longer meet criteria for that disorder later in childhood or adolescence. So today, we are fortunate to have Elizabeth joining us from Kingston, and she will talk about social and self-awareness in adolescents with autism spectrum disorder. Welcome, Beth.
Well, thank you. Thanks, Rob. I will just start my slideshow here. Hopefully everybody can see this okay. So today I'm going to be talking about a number of studies that I've been doing in the last few years that I think sort of hang together well. I started work with adolescents early in the mid to late 2000s. At that point, there was very little research done on adolescents with autism. Most work was done with kids, and I really thought that adolescents might be an interesting population to study, as well as my various students really wanting to study that. So I sort of moved from kids into adolescents. So today I'm going to be talking to you about social and self-awareness in adolescents with ASD. And these are all high-functioning adolescents. I would like to include more lower-functioning kids in my research. Some of this research is very difficult to do that with, but I am trying to include lower-functioning kids in research that I'm doing now. So high-functioning adolescents with ASD struggle a lot because they're often much more interested in social connection than their younger peers who may be still sort of socially isolated but wanting that. They tend to want friends, they want romantic partners for sure, and they want to involve themselves in the social world, but they just aren't quite sure how to do so. They're often mainstreamed into regular classrooms, so they get a lot of interaction with their typically developing peers, but they don't always necessarily have friendships with those peers. Usually, adolescents with high functioning ASD do not have much access to treatment, with a small exception of social skills groups. So they're not getting a lot of help, even though they are functioning, at a very high level. They're still experiencing difficulties. They're often bullied by their typically developing peers. So a lot of work done by myself and others has shown that the prevalence of bullying in this population is very high compared to typically developing individuals. And
yeah. Sorry, it's Rob. I'm sorry to interrupt you. Can you, at my end, and I think other people have noticed it also, it's really sort of crackly when you speak. I don't know if that's because of where the microphone is located or what, but it just sounds harsh.
I'll take it off.
What's that, sorry?
Is that better?
1,000%.
Okay. I'm just not going to be able to hear you guys very well, but I'll strain my ears. But while I'm talking, that's fine. So the onset of depression and anxiety is quite common at this age in this group. And so we need to know more about how individuals with autism, high functioning adolescents with autism, sort of understand themselves and understand the social world and their peers. So the first study I'm going to be talking about is in conjunction with my graduate student, Layla Hall. It's still in preparation. Layla was very interested in looking at friendships in ASD. She did her master's on a big project that I was doing about training attention in ASD, and these were adolescents. And she found that a lot of them were talking about online friendships. So she originally was going to do online friendships, but then she realized that there just wasn't enough out there about friendships in ASD. Nurit Bauminger in Israel has done a lot of the work in friendships in ASD and some others, but really at the time she started, it was Bauminger who was doing all the work, and most of it was looking at responses to friendship questionnaires, which had been designed for typically developing kids. And so they were finding that individuals with ASD had fewer friends, were less intimate with their friends, spent less time with their friends. But what Layla wanted to know is if this was, maybe this is what they really wanted. Maybe they weren't lower quality friendships from the perspective of the individuals themselves. So she designed a qualitative study. She had 13 males and 6 females with ASD. They were all high functioning. They were ages 13 to 16. Unfortunately, in Kingston, we have a problem in that most of our samples are completely Caucasian. If you've ever been to Kingston, you know why. The methodology she uses is constructivist grounded theory, which is really about taking your data without any preconceptions of that data and building your theory from the ground up based on the data. She collected data through interviews, semi-structured interviews, and these were done one interview with all of the participants, and then she had 6 follow-up interviews, and these were mostly done with the kids that she had interviewed at the beginning of the study, when she hadn't really figured out exactly what she wanted to ask and so forth. So follow-up interviews are permitted in this type of work, and she did those. She coded using the method of constant comparison, in which you're constantly going back and forth between your data and your theory, and your codes, making sure that your data really fits with those codes. We confirmed diagnosis with the ADOS and screened for level of intelligence with the WASI. So Layla found that there were sort of 4 phases that individuals with high-functioning ASD talked about. The first phase is sort of a pre-friendship phase. during which a foundation of knowledge is developed as the basis for familiarity and an awareness of similar interests. So this is really sort of feeling it out, looking for individuals that might share common interests, especially those that have restricted interests or very interested in developing friendships with that have a common ground there. So individuals or adolescents with autism really talked about feeling it out, that they would stand back from the group and make observations and really try to suss out whether these individuals that they thought might want to be their friends were safe, whether they were kind, whether they were considerate, whether they didn't, you know, bully others, those types of things, that they took a lot longer doing this than a typically developing child would. They also talked about the fact that they had to justify the effort, that they had to really think about whether it was worth all the time and energy to develop those friendships. And that's not something that you necessarily hear typically developing kids talking about. They sought out communities of like-minded individuals online. So this is, you know, sort of gearing to their restricted interests. If they were really interested in Pokemon, for example, they would seek out individuals that were also interested in Pokemon. And then they also talked about the difficulties of making initial contact, that being approached by others was much preferred than actually having to approach others, although in some cases they did approach others to develop those friendships. The second phase is really about becoming friends, moving from an acquaintance to a friendship. And again, there was a lot of discussion about common interests, that this fostered a stronger sense of familiarity and for comfort for these kids. So they would engage together in the common interests, really connecting that way. Then they talked about the fact that you sort of have to move beyond just pleasant interactions to really having fun together, really bonding over these common interests. They talked about some of the difficulties that they would experience in terms of executive functioning difficulties, blurting out things, social functioning difficulties where they wouldn't understand their friends and so forth. But they did say for those individuals who had friends that this became less of a barrier as familiarity increased. They also talked about clicking, and of course we know this experience of clicking with individuals, but this took a lot longer in terms of individuals with ASD, that they would have to spend a great deal more time with an individual that was trying to be their friend before they felt that sense of clicking. But they did talk about feeling that sense of clicking over time. Phase 3 is really about maintaining the friendship, and the idea that you need to maintain not constant contact, but somewhat regular contact to maintain these friendships and maintain familiarity, maintain the feeling of safety and comfort. And this at least partly relied on the continued existence of shared interests. Several individuals talked about how they were not necessarily successful in negotiating the advent of new relationships. So their friend would bring in another friend to be friends with them, and that didn't work so well. Or their friend changed interests. That was very difficult for them to maintain friendships after that. They found it very difficult to prioritize friendships. So really, they really had to work to make themselves contact their friends outside of school, if that's where their friends were, or outside of their special clubs or whatever, and choose to spend time with each other. That was a difficulty. And really keeping up that contact, doing things together, talking with some regularity was stressful for a lot of these individuals. She had an amazing number of kids who were actually holding down part-time jobs as well as going to school. I know that's not as common in the autism literature, at least. But a lot of these kids said, you know, between school and work, they just didn't really have time to keep in regular contact with their friends. Phase 4 was really about growing closer, really developing that sense of intimacy and ability to share their emotions and their feelings and their anxieties and their desires. This was a big step for many kids, and many kids said that they really hadn't reached this step yet. They realized that seeing each other with increasing regularity is really important, and outside of their school or their group, that was important. Many of you would know that, you know, if you ask a younger child in the ADOS, they ask, who are your friends? And many kids will just list off all the kids in their class. But when you say, you know, do you spend time with them outside of school, that's just non-existent. So that was really stressful for a lot of her participants, was that they didn't find time to have contact outside of school. They expressed interest, but difficulty in supporting each other and really being there for each other and sharing intimate details of their lives and their anxieties and their fears and so forth. They also experienced a lot of difficulty with conflict and learning to trust the ability to move on from conflict. So they did say, you know, as a few that had really good friends said, you know, as friendship increases, that conflict decreases, and they had learned to move on from conflict and trust that their friendship was still good, even if they had a conflict. But many individuals said that as soon as that conflict came around, that they sort of walked away from the friendship because they didn't know how to deal with it. And another issue that was difficult for these adolescents was establishing reciprocity and recognizing that friends are not just present to meet your needs, but that you also have to meet the needs of your friends. So a lot of these phases and things that they talk about overcoming are true for typically developing kids as well. Layla specifically didn't read a lot of the literature in typically developing kids because she didn't want to have a preconception when she was coding this data. But she's gone back, of course, and read it now for writing it up. And she says a lot of them are very, very similar, but the struggle is where the differences lie, and a lot of individuals with ASD just don't find that they can justify the effort. So the next study I'm going to talk about is how adolescents with ASD understand bullying scenarios, and this was also sort of stemmed from a project that was done earlier. So this was published just a few days ago, actually, in Journal of Autism and Developmental Disorders. It was in press for 2 years, which is seeming to become more and more common with this journal. But at any rate, earlier in my career, I had done a study looking at bullying prevalence and sort of some of the predictors of bullying with another student, Patricia Klusterman. But one of the things that we had collected from these kids and never looked at was their responses to bullying scenarios. So we had 2 sets of videos for the kids to watch. We had videos that were from an anti-bullying campaign, and they were very straightforward. They were just about, you know, really clear who was the bully, who was the victim. Only one thing was going on at one time. And then we had videos that were naturalistic videos. A colleague of mine, Wendy Craig, way back for her dissertation, did naturalistic study where she put microphones on kids and then videotaped them from the second floor of their school while they were out on recess. And she got all kinds of amazing data from that, and found that kids were being bullied, all the time, oftentimes with teachers even nearby. But at any rate, those videos were a little bit more difficult to sort of see what was going on. So we wanted to see if there would be an interaction between, we figured that the kids with autism would be pretty good at understanding the straightforward videos, but less good at understanding the naturalistic videos. So we had 29 males with ASD, adolescents, and we only had males because the bullying experiences are very different in typically developing kids in males and females. And so we didn't want to sort of confuse things in terms of having things be different between males and females with a relatively small sample size. You probably all know that getting high functioning females with ASD can be very difficult. So we just had males, and we had, I didn't mention it here, but all the controls were males as well. They were matched on full scale IQ. And they were shown 6 different bullying videos, one each of the naturalistic and the staged videos for stolen possessions, physical bullying, and social aggression. So after they were shown these videos, they were given a definition of bullying. We wanted to make sure they were sort of all on the same page, because some of them may have had, bullying interventions in their school and some of them hadn't. So we gave them the definition and then we showed them the videos. Sorry, we gave them the definition first and then showed them the videos and asked them questions about the videos, including how would you describe this situation to a friend? We asked them first, is this bullying? And if they said no, we said, is this aggression? If they said it was bullying, we asked who the bullies were. If they said it was aggression, we asked who were the aggressors and then who were the victims. And we also had a couple of other questions. The proportion of correct answers were calculated for each of the bullying types. So hopefully you can see this on your screen fairly well. You can see that in all of the different bullying types, these are all significant differences. So in all of them, individuals with ASD scored below their typically developing peers on the proportion of answers that they got correct. We also looked to see if there was differences between the different types of bullying, and although nothing was significant, you can see the means are all sort of in the same direction for both groups. Physical bullying was the easiest, whereas social bullying was the most difficult for all groups. We also looked at whether there was an interaction for type of video, but there was not. All individuals in the study found it more difficult to sort of parse apart the naturalistic videos than they did the staged videos. So this sort of, the take-home message from this study is that bullying is not only more experienced by individuals with ASD, but they have a more difficult time sort of understanding what's going on in the situation. The last set of studies I'm going to talk to you about were done in collaboration primarily with my graduate student, Sarah Furlano. The Furlano et al. In Autism Research in 2015 was her master's publication, and her dissertation is currently published online in the Journal of Autism and Developmental Disorders. And then Vandervoort 2018 is an honors thesis, which I'll talk about, that was related to these studies and that we're still collecting collecting data for. I sort of put it on the back burner for a while, but I'm starting to collect it again. So these are all about how adolescents with ASD understand themselves rather than understanding others. And Sarah, sort of postulated that because individuals with ASD have such poor theory of mind for the most part, both for themselves and for others, it's possible that their self-concept is not very clear. And at the time when she started these studies, there was very little research on this in ASD. There was a fair amount in ADHD, which found that these kids had what was called a positive illusory bias. That is, they tended to overestimate their performance on all sorts of measures, academic, social skills, behavior, etc. But there was, as I said, very little research in ASD. And the only research that was out there were 2 studies that looked at the individuals, the children's ability to rate their own symptoms, and they compared them to their parents' rating of their symptoms. And they found that parents rated that the children had much more symptoms than the children they themselves rated. However, there's possibility that this is, subjective. Well, it is subjective, and there's a possibility that, parents were saying symptoms that the kids had had before that they no longer had, etc. So Sarah really wanted to test this on something that was much more objective and sort of less global and more focused. So she looked at their understanding of their own academic performance. So for the first study, she looked at their ability to estimate their academic ability in comparison to a typically developing control group. And we had 19 adolescents with ASD here and 22 typically developing kids. Unfortunately, we had more females in the typically developing group, and I'll talk about that later. We gave them 15 math calculation questions and 15 verbal synonym questions from the Woodcock-Johnson. And what we did was ask the parents what their grade level was in math and what their grade level was in English. And then we developed, we had a whole bunch of set of questions that were both pre their grade level and post their grade level. So there were easy questions, there were medium questions, and there were hard questions, so that we wouldn't get floor or ceiling effects. And they were shown these questions and asked to predict their performance before they did them, and then they were asked again after they did them how they thought they did. So we had them split into verbal and math. The ASD group is in the darker purple. So you can see that the ASD, and these are different scores. So the idea is, say the child with autism said they were going to get 15 correct, but they really only got 13 correct. Then they would have a different score for the pre-test of 2. So you can see that that was around where the verbal pretest was for the ASD group. They were a little bit more accurate, although this was not significantly different at the verbal post-test scores, so after they had done the task, sort of predicting how well they had done. Interestingly, the typically developing kids underestimated their ability beforehand. The post-test was not different from 0, but this was different from 0. Can you all see my pointer? Can somebody say yes? You're all muted. Have you all gone to sleep?
No.
No. We can't see the pointer? Okay, so I'm pointing at the verbal pretest scores here, and that was significantly different from 0 for the typically developing kids. So they were underestimating their abilities. For the math, they also overestimated their abilities, although the typically developing kids did as well. there were significant differences between the ASD and the typically developing children. So when Sarah was defending her master's thesis, one of her committee members said, you know, well, maybe it's possible that they're just blurting out a large number. When you say, you know, how many do you think you're going to get right, or how many you think you got right, they're just blurting out a large number because of their inhibition difficulties. So we added a how many do you think you will get wrong, or how many do you think you got wrong condition. That's called the incorrect condition. We kept the correct condition. This is her dissertation. We added a feedback condition. So it was hypothesized in her defense, you know, maybe it's just that they can't keep track of their ability, at least for the post-test questions. So we added a feedback condition in which they were given clear feedback, a green check mark if they got it right, and a red X if they got it wrong. So we could see if they could keep track of that feedback. They were asked about their confidence in their predictions. So we asked them to rate on a scale of 1 to 5 how confident they were about their answer. And then finally, Sarah really hypothesized that this must be related to episodic memory, that kids would sort of have to go back to the last math test that they had, or the last verbal test that they had, and think about how they did, and so think about how they might do in this situation. So we used the California Verbal Learning Test to assess episodic memory, and that's the delayed condition. The idea is you memorize a list of words and then ask or have the participant memorize a list of words, and then ask the participant 20 minutes later what those words were. And the idea is that this is episodic memory because you had to remember the condition of learning the words. I'm not so on board that this is episodic memory, but it's widely used in the literature, so we used that. And we also used an autobiographical memory task that we had adopted from another study, in which we asked the kids to talk about something that had happened to them in the last week, something that had happened in the last year, and then something that had happened when they were little. And what we did was just score the amount of sort of self-referencing that they did within that task. So how many times they said, you know, I did this, I felt this, that kind of thing. So those were those tasks. This is the pre-task self-perception difference score. So you can see once again that the ASD kids are overestimating their ability. The numbers are larger than the master's project because she combined the verbal and math tests. She found that there wasn't any significant differences between them, and they were highly correlated, so she combined them for more power. Oh, I should mention we had 30 kids in each group, and this time they were matched well on gender. So you can see that they are, whether it's the correct condition, how many do you think you'll get right, or the incorrect condition, how many do you think you'll get wrong, they still answered more than the typically developing kids did. In the post-task self-performance difference or self-perception difference score, they continued to answer higher than the comparison group, except for in the feedback condition. So when they got that feedback of a bright red check marker, bright green X, they were more able to keep track of how they were doing, and there was no significant difference between the ASD group and the TD group, but there was a significant difference in the ASD group and TD group for the correct and incorrect post-task. So after they had performed the task, how many do you think you got right? Interestingly, the numbers are a little bit lower than the pre-task, but they were not significantly different. So the feedback certainly made them more accurate. There was no relationship between accuracy and confidence. In fact, our confidence scores looked a little bit wacky, so we didn't include them in the paper because they just yeah, they had a very non-normal distribution, and it was very strange. Surprisingly, there was no relationship between accuracy and episodic memory. So that California verbal learning task and the autobiographical memory score, we combined them into one because they were highly correlated, and made them Z scores, and there was no relationship between the different scores and episodic memory. So the take home from, well, actually, I'll do the next study and then talk about the take home. So I had an honors thesis student in 2018 who was interested to see if we could replicate this online with a much larger sample, but she was also a Con Ed student, and she knew the literature in typically developing kids, which showed that males are much more likely to overestimate their abilities in an academic realm than females. So especially in math. So we wanted to look at whether there were gender differences. So we wanted to look at it just in ASD to start out with. Unfortunately, we got 87 males, but unfortunately we only got 16 females. We widened the age range a little bit, but still only got 16 females. So now I'm in the process of trying to just collect females to look at some of these differences. You know, the bad thing about doing online studies is that you can't match your groups on IQ. There's really no good IQ tests that are online, and you can't confirm your diagnosis with an ADOS. You have to use an SCQ. One of the things we did to sort of try to minimize difficulties with diagnosis was that we only accepted diagnoses from psychologists, psychiatrists, neurologists, and developmental pediatricians. If a family doctor or school had diagnosed them, we didn't accept that. So we didn't find any significant gender differences. All the means were kind of in the expected direction in that boys were overestimating more than females. The math pre-test score is right at 0 for females, which is why you can't see it. So we're hoping that we can collect more data from females and see if these are in the expected direction. So really the take home from this set of studies is that individuals with ASD not only have difficulties understanding others, but they have difficulties in their own self-concept, even when you use a very even when you use a very objective measure that's very concrete. So in summary of these studies, adolescents do seem to have some insight about initiating and maintaining friendships, although there was wide variability in the insight that Layla found, even among 19 participants. Adolescents with ASD do struggle with aspects of developing and maintaining friendships. They don't seem to understand bullying scenarios as well as their typically developing peers. And youth with ASD consistently overestimate their academic ability both before and after completing academic tasks, unless they're given explicit feedback. So this may be related to gender, we're not sure. But overall, they're still experiencing difficulty understanding themselves and understanding others, even these very high functioning individuals. So I'd like to thank all my funding sources, the amazing families who participate in this research, the dozens of volunteers that have worked in my lab over the years, and thank you all to you for listening. And I guess I'll stop sharing my screen now. Or I'll leave it up actually, just in case people have questions about specific data. So I'll take questions. Are you going to moderate those questions, Rob? Or
Yeah, I can. Thank you, Beth. That was a wonderful overview of a nice sort of series of studies that sort of feed nicely to each other, and that was fantastic, actually.
Thank
I
you.
appreciate that. So, as I mentioned, if people have questions, we can, if you raise your hand, I will try and address them. So Claire Mitchell had her hand raised first. So as we learned in elementary school, she can go first. And so Claire, I will allow you to talk. It says I'm allowing you to talk. It makes it sound a bit more serious than I intended to be. But the, oh, now she's lowered her hand now. So if people have questions, please. All right, so Dr. Goldberg actually had a question. And so I think if I may sort of paraphrase it, I think that his question, he wrote, is there a role for social skills training? I guess the question would be, Beth, how do you take these findings and how do we translate them?
Yeah, absolutely. I think there is a role for social skills training. Unfortunately, a lot of the kids that were in these studies had social skills training. I think a lot of times they can learn the rules, but they don't necessarily know how to apply them, especially in social situations that are moving so quickly and there's multiple people talking and there's all kinds of subtle things going on. I think that not to say, I don't want to make it sound like it's hopeless. I don't think that at all. But I think one of the things that might be better served for an individual with ASD is really having peer mentors in which that individual can be there with them in the social situations, give them hints, talk to them later about what went on and why it went on and those kinds of things, so that they can get more generalization, I guess, is what I'm trying to say, across different situations, because the social skills, at least as far as I know what kids are getting in Kingston, I don't think that they generalize very well to the real world necessarily. Some in some aspects they do, and some they certainly help. I'm not going to say that they hinder the kids, but I think we need more research going into these social skills groups. There's very little research out there, and we need to think about possibly other methods of helping these kids.
So I think your point, Beth, is really interesting because you mentioned the whole issue of theory of mind a couple of times. And when you were talking earlier, you said that when you were talking about the sort of the stages of friendship, and that the subjects who were involved in that study, the first one you described, that they knew that, you said initially they were reluctant to initiate interaction with others. Any sense of why that was?
Probably because they'd been bullied, but partially, at least for some kids. For other kids, I think it's just they're not sure, who's sort of gonna justify the effort and who's not, and they want to make sure that the person that they a lot of times they talked about just is it a nice person, is this person going to be nice to me, are they nice to other people, and so maybe they'll be nice to me.
But I guess some of those thoughts would require some level of theory of mind.
Yes, absolutely. These are really, a lot of the kids that come in have, they would definitely pass first order and some second order theory of mind tests. In some cases, they don't meet on the ADOS, so we have to do an ADI with them and use clinical impression as well, because they're doing so well on paper, but they're still experiencing a lot of struggles in their daily life.
All right, Nicole Shearer has a question. So Nicole, I will allow you to talk, as I say. If you could just unmute yourself, and then we'll keep our fingers crossed that it works.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay, so my question is, recently I've been doing some work reading about the relationship between alexithymia and social competence in kids with ASD. Mm-hmm. And given we know that emotions play such an important role in kind of navigating the social world, I was wondering what your thoughts are about comorbid alexithymia in the ASD population and how this might relate to bullying and establishing and maintaining friendships, particularly whether it might explain some of that variability that you described in the insights about initiating and maintaining friendships.
Yeah, absolutely. I've been reading a bit about that as well. And it's interesting because alexithymia, like when I first started Queens, I had a colleague that was studying alexithymia, and it was sort of poo-pooed by a lot of people, especially people in the typically developing emotion regulation and emotion literature, and now it's really becoming much more well accepted, I think. And it is interesting. You know, I've seen a couple of studies in which alexithymia predicted emotion processing, sort of took away all the variants due to autism once that alexithymia was put in there. So I think it is, for those of you who don't know what alexithymia is, it's the inability to sort of perceive and understand and label and really grasp, you know, emotions in oneself and other people. So I think that it does play a large role, absolutely. I can't remember exactly what your question was. Did that answer it?
I know one of the comments you made is there was large variability in the insights that your ASD kids had
yes.
in your study. So I was wondering if maybe some comorbid alexithymia might account for some of that variability. Maybe depending on whether the children had comorbid alexithymia, that could explain why some were better and some were worse at kind of having these insights into what's going on with their peers and how to interact with their peers.
Yes, I think, I mean, hindsight's 20/20 vision, right? I if we were to do this study over again, there's definitely other measures that we would have included, and the Toronto Alexithymia scale would have been one of them, because I think it is important. Yeah, but we didn't.
Awesome. Well, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Beth, with regard to the question of whether it be comorbid, do you think would it be comorbid as in a separate condition occurring at the same time, or do you think that'd be part of autism for some people?
Well, it's interesting because the research that I'm reading anyway, and a lot of this is really new and hasn't been replicated, but I did read a study the other day that found alexithymia was only present in 50% of individuals with ASD. I'm pretty sure it was an adult group. So if it's only present in 50%, is it, you know, part of the disorder? I mean, you could argue that it is, you could argue that it isn't. So I'm not sure. I think we definitely need more research in this area, because it's all very new, and it needs to be replicated, and it needs to be explored further.
Okay, so the next person is Paula Walsh-Bergen from Ottawa. So Paula, I am asking you to unmute.
Hi, can you hear me okay?
Yep.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for doing this. Yeah, I'm dealing with more young adults and into adulthood. I'm noticing, as we all are, I think, a lot of depression as they leave high school, with their excellent supports most of the time they get at high school and the social group there, with all those losses. Do you have any suggestions based on what you found to help mitigate some of these problems?
Yeah, I actually, from doing all these studies, I'm not a clinical psychologist, I'm a developmental psychologist, and from doing all these studies, I became very interested in in depression, because everybody was talking about depression. All the participants were talking to you know, the graduate students about their depression, and it was obviously an issue for a lot of these adolescents. So I'm starting research into that now. I think, you know, it's really hard to pull apart. I created a sort of one of the things that I'm doing, sort of pilot data for a grant, is to look at all the different aspects of depression and try to figure out, asking parents whether they think it's part of the disorder, or whether it's part of autism, or whether it's part of depression or something else. And I was practicing with my students. They were interviewing me, and of course I always want to have an actual participant in mind. So I thought of my godson, who's actually now 23, but I thought of him when he was 18, so he could be eligible for the study. And I realized that a lot of the depressive symptoms, I think his mother, I was answering as his mother, and I think his mother would have answered that all stemmed from his autism. So things like, you know, not eating well, or not sleeping, or his inability to make decisions, his difficulty, not just social withdrawal, which is the obvious one, right? But all kinds of different depressive symptoms. His mom would have said are from autism. So I think it's really hard to pull it apart sometimes. And so I don't know, you know, not being a clinical psychologist, I don't know how to best advise parents or clinicians on how to deal with this. But I think it's something that we absolutely have to be aware of. And even if the kids don't meet clinical criteria for depression, that they're still experiencing a lot of symptoms that are depression-like, that need to be worked on.
My husband's a special education teacher in high school here as well in Ottawa, and you know, certainly he does an excellent job of preparing some of the kids. But you know, even with that, a lot of the parents really get quite panicked when the kids are discharged or graduating. And I know there's some programs that are successful. I know here at Algonquin College, they have a program that the kids can attend for, you know, 2 to 3 years to do some more educational sort of work towards working and some social skills stuff. And there's some good programs where they'll have like gaming nights and stuff, but there's really a dearth of services out there for these folks. And it's really quite tragic.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, my godson in some ways is fortunate in that he also has an intellectual disability. I think there's a lot more programs out there for those individuals than the higher functioning individuals. I know York has a really good program run by Jim Bebko, trying to integrate individuals with really high functioning autism into university, and they have a great peer mentorship program, and they've had some success with individuals actually, you know, getting through university, which is wonderful. But for a lot of individuals, that's not going to be feasible. And yeah, what do you do with them, and how do you try to support them and train them for something that they can find meaningful, you know, life, can find a meaningful life out of. There's far too many individuals with ASD that are out of work and depressed and don't have, you know, don't have good friends or romantic partners, or experience a very low quality of life.
Thank you.
So next up, but I was going to say, it's not too often we say that somebody's lucky to have an intellectual disability.
Yeah.
But I think when it comes to services, it certainly makes a difference, which is not fair necessarily. So next, perhaps last question for Elizabeth is from Margot Struthers here in London. Where did Margot? There she is. Yeah, go ahead, Margot.
Oh, hi. I guess it's really a similar question to the one about alexithymia. Another contributing factor would potentially be clinically significant difficulties with attention. I was thinking in particular, Layla, in the first study that you talked about, and I wondered whether that data was collected.
No, unfortunately not. All we collected, we didn't know how long these interviews were going to take. We didn't know how long, and we did it all in one session, the ADOS and the WASI and the interview. So in retrospect, there's a lot of stuff that I would have liked to collect it over 2 sessions, but we didn't have that on those individuals. But I agree with you absolutely that inattention is, an issue. I mean, it's certainly an issue in social development and ADHD and social difficulties there. So there's no reason to think that it wouldn't be the same in our kids.
Right. Thanks.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, we have, anybody else have questions for Beth following her fantastic talk? Beth, what do you make of the discrepancy, I suppose, between people with autism and their ability to judge themselves in social situations as opposed to judging their sort of academic skills anywhere, and the discrepancy between them?
Yeah, I mean, since Sarah has done this work, there's been a lot more work on social understanding of self and overestimation, and the findings have been more mixed than her findings, which are, I think, pretty clear. So I think I'm not sure why this would be a particular difficulty. Other than episodic memory, but we didn't find anything with our measures, but perhaps our measures were not great. Episodic memory is not the easiest thing to test. So I would say that might have something to do with it, but I'm not really sure what the discrepancy is. They do, in some studies, seem to have a better sense of self than these studies would say, but
okay, Beth, thank you for joining us. I mean, that was wonderful, everything we expected and more.